to The Family Skeptical, Parenting Through Nonbelief.
We're a married atheist couple raising two wonderful, strange children. We ask big questions, dissect weird parenting moments, and examine how society ignores or misrepresents families like ours. If you're any stripe of non-believer who's involved in raising children, welcome. You are our people.
Our kids have heard all our swears, but yours might not have. So be thoughtful if there are young people listening with you. Whew. It's been a week.
Yeah, is this episode going out on Valentine's Day?
No, before that.
Okay.
Yeah. I have plans for a sort of Valentine's Day-esque episode, it's like a week after Valentine's Day, I think.
Okay.
Yeah. So I feel like I need to do a blanket PSA for the next 4 years. Which, or maybe the rest of time, which is just a reminder that based on the fact that I have a full-time job and this is just something we do because it brings me joy and satisfaction, that we record about 3 weeks before you ever hear any of these episodes. It takes me 3 weeks to edit and get things posted. So as the world gets increasingly strange, we are never going to be timely in anything we say about it. So that is just the reality. We'll certainly talk about things that we feel like we have something to say about, but it's certainly not going to be the first thing you hear about anything. And that is true of so much that has happened in the last weeks. But one of the big things is the LA fires, because we spent still the majority of our lives together in LA. Rita and Go were both born in LA on Hollywood Boulevard. And
no, they weren't born on Hollywood Boulevard.
They weren't?
Like literally on Hollywood Boulevard, the street?
No, but on a building on Hollywood Boulevard.
Incorrect again.
Was it Sunset? Okay.
Sunset. There is no Kaiser Hollywood. I shudder to think what a hospital on a Hollywood Boulevard would operate like.
It's very close to Hollywood Boulevard.
I
would drive up and take Hollywood Boulevard home. I'd stop for Mexican hot chocolate.
But that doesn't mean it was on Hollywood Boulevard, my love.
But you get the point.
Yeah, totally wrong. Totally wrong, but you get the point. That's like watching Trump describe how hurricanes work. Maybe you should have a Sharpie. Maybe that's something we can do for our Patreon. It's like Moms describes things badly with a Sharpie and a whiteboard.
I was 2 blocks off. I don't know what his description was, but I assume that metaphorically it was farther than 2 blocks.
Okay, I'll give you the benefit of the doubt on that
one. So look, knock on wood, most of what has happened, but it's just a strange time to be in the world. I was thinking about it because I love the podcast You Are Wrong About. And I feel like it's such the perfect skeptic podcast, because just the whole point of it is taking something where you've sort of heard the story in the news or pop culture and explaining how it's far more complex or different than you perceived it to be.
Sure.
And they just had an episode about the guy they made the movie about, where he got his arm stuck in the rock when he was hiking and had to chop it off.
Yes.
All their episodes are great. It's a great episode. But one of the things they talked about is kind of how, he did amazing things to get through that experience, but that he was a young man who had been prone to risky behavior before that. And as part of that discussion, the woman they had on to talk about it is sort of like a wilderness expert. So she comes on whenever there's sort of like a wilderness survival story. And she talked about how when she talked, I wonder if she's wrong. She talked about it. She said it's specifically for avalanches, but it sounds to me like it would be more broad. But she talked about common lies that people tell themselves that like lead to people being caught or killed in avalanches. And it's pretty fascinating. And I think it's like another great sort of thing to listen to from like a skeptic standpoint, like the tricks that our minds can play on us that make us less rational or thoughtful than we think we're being.
Sure.
And one of the things she talked about is, I've done this before and been okay, therefore it's going to be okay, as like one of those mistakes that people make.
Sure.
In situations. And I was just thinking about that in terms of LA, because when we were living there, you know, whenever there were fires, my mom would call and be really worried. And I would always say, like, you don't, like, fires don't come where we are.
Except that now they were.
And now they do. And I just think, you know, for people who didn't live in LA, you know, LA is prone to national disasters. And I think it would be easy to think that people are sort of prepared or know that these things are going to happen. But it is just hard to explain how far these fires stretched into places where people really, you know, you're
swaths of concrete.
Yeah.
Like it's not like it was a field or a hill with like scrub brush all over it. It was the concrete jungle of the San Fernando Valley.
You know, and it's like, you're ready for earthquakes, you're ready for other things. But I think in a lot of these places, based on what had happened before, it made total sense to just like think fires were not an issue.
Yeah.
And I think where we were living just escaped getting evacuated.
Yep.
But was really just sandwiched right between other neighborhoods that were.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so I just...
It's frightening.
It's frightening. And I'm just trying to... It made me realize that it is good to get prepared and be careful about things, even if I don't know. It made me think about what sort of assumptions I'm making.
Right.
About what I do and do not need to be prepared for. And how it's good to have plans in place and just like... Also, yeah, I don't know if you can tell. We have friends over today, so there might be more children noises than normal. But so yeah, it was just really hard. I know on social media, I said I would talk about where we were thinking of donating. So I wanted to do that as well. We have had such a strange time that we haven't done that yet, but we will. I think another thing in these disasters, it's very easy to think about them right when things are as bad as they can be, but also just understanding that like LA is going to be a different place probably for years to come. So if you're somebody who does your giving towards the end of the year around the holidays, try to keep this in your thoughts, though who knows what else will really need our care and attention at that time. So obviously, a lot of people talked about YMCA LA. There's some people I follow in LA who have talked about like just how much they've been on the ground helping people with childcare for people who are displaced and first responders. Pasadena Humane Society has done a huge amount. But there are a couple of places that might not have gotten as much attention. Atheist United LA has been doing good work. They have a fund that they're going to make sure goes to secular charities in the area. They opened up their offices as a temporary shelter during the fires. So I'll post the link to their website as well. And then on a smaller scale, we know somebody who runs a small animal shelter in LA who also has been doing amazing work. And Pops, I was hoping you could give those details.
His name is Joey Tuccio, Tuccio, and he coordinates often with the Animal Rescue Mission, which is really, really excellent. But also, you can find him at his Instagram account, which is at starts with one today, one spelled ONE, starts with one today. And yeah, he does such amazing things, but it's it's a situation is so bad in Los Angeles when it comes to animals that it really, whatever, if you care about animals and you want to help, like any of the shelters, any of the rescue organizations, any of them, all of them, they all need such help right now that you could go to my buddy Joey Tuccio, or you could just reach out to like the Pasadena Humane Association, for instance, because it isn't just the pets that are rescued or abandoned, some of which will be reunited with their owners, some of which won't. It's about the pets that are hurt and the animals that are hurt who need rehabilitation and care, and also the wildlife that are displaced. It's just the most insane situation. But yes, like all of the animal charities could use help.
And just one thing I've wanted to talk about this year, which I think we're finally going to make happen, is fostering and secular fostering. And I'm not super familiar with this foundation, but I did as much due diligence as I could, and they get really high ratings on like Charity Navigator and look to be queer friendly and secular. But United Friends of the Children is another one we'll link to, which is helping foster youth in LA and kids aging out of the foster system. And I'm sure those people have just as many needs, if not more, in these kind of situations. So
for sure, 100%.
And final thing, if you are looking for a podcast that covers political issues that would be of interest to secular folks, I cannot recommend The Scathing Atheist more highly. Every week they pull the news that you need to know and are hilarious, which makes it slightly less painful to listen to. So if you are looking for somebody who's going to cover what's happening right now, you should definitely check them out. Was that a mom? Are you okay? What happened? All right. So we are back, and I am so excited to air this interview we did. It has been a crazy time in the world in a lot of ways, and this interview made me really happy that there is a place that just sounds like magical and really awesome. So we had the chance to talk with Katie, who is a volunteer at Camp Quest, which is an amazing summer camp founded on the conviction that all kids deserve fun, friends, and free thought. She has been a volunteer there for 23 years. They're coming up on their 30-year anniversary. And she's also a 42-year-old retired professor with a PhD in religion and has 10 kids through marriage, adoption, and foster care. And I just had such a good time speaking with her, and I'm really excited about you learning more about Camp Quest. With the show notes, we're going to post something that shows all the camp dates. They have camps sprinkled throughout the US, so definitely check it out to see if there's one by you. And here we go. So, Katie, thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, I'm very happy to be here and excited to talk about camp. It's one of my favorite topics.
Well, this is like, the timing could not be perfect because Pops and I were just having a conversation about what to do with Reader and Go for the summer. So this is like that time of year. And I can't believe we have to plan this stuff in January and February. But every year I have to remind myself, like, these plans have to be made, even though like kids' interests can change.
Right.
completely between this time and summer, but still.
Yeah. Well, and there's just so much coordination to do, right? You have to like figure out, you know, what are the camps and what are the activities and how do they all interface with each other and where can you like find those sweet spots to get some things in for your kids that you want them to experience.
Exactly. And so you are joining us to talk about Camp Quest. And I am so glad because I had like heard about Camp Quest, but I don't feel like it is like, after meeting part of your team at the American Atheist Convention. I started following you guys on Instagram. And it wasn't until then that I was like, oh, this is 100% cooler than I realized.
Yeah.
Like, I thought it was cool when I heard about it, but I did not, and I still don't feel like I understand. Like, I see those pictures and I'm like, what is this weird wonderland that has been created? So to start us off, can you tell us a little bit about what Camp Quest is and how it got started?
Sure. So Camp Quest, we're actually about to celebrate our 30-year anniversary. So we started in 1996. And the organization was really formed in opposition to the Boy Scouts. That was one of the original impetuses for the founding of the organization. So at that time, right, the Boy Scouts had a ban on atheist members and a ban on LGBTQ kids and members. And so the organization was trying to provide an alternative to say, like, this is a place where we'll be accepting and inclusive of all people. And it was founded at a time in 1996 where like the atheist movement was growing, right? We were trying to figure out like, how do we forge ourselves ahead as a movement and make it a change. And so the camp was part of trying to address what people recognized was a need that kids had to feel safe when they came from a family that was identifying as atheist or secular, something I've heard you all talk about on your podcast, right? Like this sort of anxiety that we still have 30 years later, that maybe our kids won't be accepted or maybe there'll be a stigma associated with that label. So that's where it began. We've evolved over time. I would not say that we've evolved away from our secularism or our secular humanist values, but I would say we have evolved away from some of the early, very much like kind of the stereotypes of the atheist movement at that time, right? We had a lot of older folks who began us who were very much part of that like vanguard of like kind of brash, in your face folks that began that sort of contemporary atheist movement. And I would say now we are very much on the side of like that sort of kind, gentle, safe and welcoming space. We really, even from the beginning, never really cared about a kid's identity. Very much we believed that children deserve to choose their own path. And that's really where we've landed very strongly. How can we be the safest space for kids? And how do we organize ourselves around the principle that all kids deserve access to fun, friends, and free thought? And that is really what unites us, that we believe that kids have the right to choose and they have the right not to be indoctrinated in their childhoods. And so we provide a space for flourishing there. And we are also just absolutely goofy as all get out. So that's kind of our big picture origin where we are today kind of thing.
Okay. And how many Camp Quests are there in the US?
Right now, I believe we have officially 8 affiliates. Some of them run multiple sessions. So like our Camp Quest North affiliate runs 3 sessions. One's in the Pacific Northwest, run 2. So I have a lovely graphic that I will give to you all that you can put next to the podcast with all of our locations right now and all their dates for 2025. So you'll be able to see it there.
Amazing. And when you say sessions, am I right that most of these are like week-long sessions?
Yeah. Yes, that is our program model, is week-long sleepaway summer camp sessions. So we do some little things on the side that we can talk about later with sort of conferences and things. But largely our model is that like getting kids out of their family dynamic and into this completely different environment where we get to manage and sort of do our thing, our youth development thing for a week.
And then how did you sort of get involved in these movements in Camp Quest?
Yeah. So Camp Quest began in the like Kentucky, Ohio, Cincinnati area. And I went to Miami of Ohio, which is just outside of Cincinnati. And I was raised Catholic. And I realized pretty quickly once I got into college and learned what an atheist was, that that's who I was. And so I formed with a few of my friends, like the first atheist and agnostics group at Miami University. And we wanted to have an event. So being 19, we thought, what would be more amazing than having just like a really crazy debate over the existence of God, right? Pointless, attention getting. So we did that. And the person that we found to come debate was Edwin Kagan, who was the very first camp director at our Ohio camp. And even though he was not, there was a team that founded Camp Quest from the Free Inquiry Group, which was the greater Cincinnati, Kentucky area. He and his wife, Helen, were the two that really ran with it, directed the camp, and then were very much the vanguards of spreading it across the country, so recruiting other people in. So he came for this debate, and he was just such an over-the-top person. And I mean, the debate was entirely unproductive, but fun. And when we were at dinner together, his wife told me about Camp Quest and said, we really need female counselors and we want younger people too. And so I had been to camp my whole childhood. I had gone to like a band and music camp, and it was very influential to me. So it sounded pretty good. And I went, and then I just never looked back. I've just been involved really heavily ever since. It was very formative for me. Even though I wasn't a camper, I was still so young when I started that it had a massive influence on my young adult trajectory.
Yeah. Man, at that age, I had no idea what to do with kids. That would have been so terrifying.
Yeah, because I was from a Catholic family, I was also the oldest of all of the cousins on both sides of my family. So in some ways, I feel like this prepped me for like the chaos, going to my grandma's house on holidays and watching all the kids prepped me for the chaos of what camp is all about.
That makes sense. We are both only children. So I had the opposite experience.
Yeah, I really think I've discovered that chaos is my happy place, since I also have 10 kids of my own. I like being surrounded by apparently screaming and chaos.
Yes. Yeah. There's a lot of screaming and chaos with two. So it is.
Yes.
It's hard to imagine.
It is exactly what you'd imagine too. You're chaos.
Okay. So when I first heard about Camp Quest, I sort of thought like, oh, it's summer camp, but there's not going to be any religious dogma. And maybe there is some, I don't even know what I thought, like more of a focus on science maybe, and those kind of things. And then I've been watching the Instagram, and like, can you talk about what happens at Camp Quest? Because, so I hope you're not insulted by this term, but when we were looking where to live, we looked at a couple of cities, and Pops kind of hates it. But in one city we looked at, we were driving around, and I think at one point I was just like, but where are the weirdos? Like, where are the weirdos? And that's always sort of been my vibe. Like, if I feel like there are, in the opening to the show, we describe our kids as strange. One of my family members was worried about that. But, I'm always sort of most comfortable when I feel like I have some like weird, strange goofballs around me. And when I've been watching the Instagram feed, I'm like, I don't know how, but like there is some amazing stuff happening at this camp. So can you talk a little bit about the activities and kind of like what the vibe is? Because I feel like it is very different than just like a camp without religion or bigotry.
Right. Absolutely. I mean, I really think the free thought component of it is what feeds that environment that we have. And I do think is coming across in our social media really beautifully right now. It's something we've been deeply invested in. Is we know we're doing something incredibly special. And it's hard to get people to understand that, because we're not just like an atheist camp or a camp where you're going to send your kids and we're going to be like, science is the best and you must do this or think this. It's just like not that serious. It is very much about, let's give you an experience where you feel so safe, so able to be whoever it is that you want to be, even if that changes like during this day, right? If you like, you can explore all these new parts of who you are, and everyone is going to embrace that. And then the other piece of it is that your vulnerability capacity goes through the roof, right? So you can be silly, doing a song, spinning around in a circle, flapping your hands, sticking out your tongue. You're with a whole bunch of other adults and kids who are all doing the same thing. Everybody's let go of this idea that we need to have pretense or put up a certain front about who we are. And we are very, very good at creating that environment on day one of camp. And so by the time camp is over, everybody just feels this sense of profound release and liberation and groundedness and community. And that really is the power of what we do, is we give kids and adults a place to come and just feel unburdened by the realities of the world that is outside, to come work through some of those things, to find deep friendship and community, and then to just be completely weird together. And that is like one of the big highlights of what we do. Fashion shows and, lots of traditional stuff too. We have horseback riding and zip lining, and, we're at camps that provide these traditional activities. We're going on nature hikes. But I promise you, we're doing it weird for sure. And we're like very embracing of that kind of culture. I think another thing that is hard for us to bring across, or we're trying to figure out ways to bring across, is the power of what it feels like to be in a community like ours. So a lot of summer camps are young adults who are counselors, maybe a few older folks who are, running the show, doing the administrative stuff, and then a bunch of kids. Our camps are run by volunteers. The vast majority of which on any of our staff will be people who have been there for years and years and years. I've been participating for 23 years. There are people who've been involved in our organization even longer than me. We have so many campers that become counselors. Like, there is this deep sense of connectedness, and it's very intergenerational. So your kids are getting contact with people from a wide age range, and they are also getting access to a lot of people who are there for a variety of really interesting reasons. So some people are there because they have this like profound desire to teach, like the adults. So we have lots of teachers and counselors and social workers and those kinds of folks. And then we have a lot of folks that are there because they used to be at camp and now they're adults and they want to create those experiences for young people and explore that part of them. A really surprising number of people who are child free. And this is one of the places that they come to be able to have that impact and have that connection that, being parents, we know like kids offer us this like access to joy and experiences that you can see through the eyes of your children. And like you get to do that at camp too. And it's a really cool thing. But it's just this very like intentional, welcoming, safe community. And we have a really incredible retention rate. And it's just like you're coming home. And that's how it feels for everybody that second year, right? The first year, it's like, wow, this is a lot of people who know each other. The whole thing, right? Like, I'm already, surrounded by inside jokes and all sorts of things. And one of the ways we've had to really grow over the years is to figure out how to navigate that, right? We need that constant stream of new folks coming in. And sometimes it could feel a little intimidating because they would look at it and be like, wow, I want to be part of this. But it's scary because it feels like these people really are deeply connected, the campers, the counselors. So we've gotten really good at breaking that down and opening up our community, welcoming people in, making them feel so deeply connected, and then bringing it the next year as well.
What's your favorite way of breaking it down, as you say?
Yeah. So we believe in icebreakers. We believe in getting goofy real quick. So we do all sorts of like opening activities with like, we'll do like a tournament where you do rock, paper, scissors, and you do 2x2 at first, and whoever wins has to go to the back. And then you have to chant the name of the person who's the winner. And you're just going around this room. It is filled with the echoing calls of people, chanting each other's name, cheering for one another. And it's just silly and goofy. But we also do in cabin time, where we have structured questions that the kids can ask to one another, or the counselors will talk about things. A lot of our camps will do like boundary and like camp agreement settings at the very beginning, and that can be really bonding for kids. So we try to hit it from a number of angles because kids and adults are all different. And then a lot of it too is recognizing and training our staff to see who's struggling. And that's for the adults and for the kids, right? So we are incredibly attentive to who's looking glazed over, who's looking overwhelmed, who might need a pair of headphones, right? Like that kind of thing. And so when people start to recognize early on that we're attentive to your needs and we're paying attention, and that is one of our jobs as returning folks and as adults is to pay attention to your cues, I think it helps people feel safe.
Yeah.
And to know that someone's looking out for them. And that really seems to make a big difference.
No, that does make a difference. It really engenders trust.
Right.
That is so huge because I can't tell you how many times I've been to places set up for kids.
Mm-hmm.
And there is clearly a kid who like doesn't know what to do or is not doing okay. and nobody responds.
Yep. And you know who led those efforts? It was our young people, because that's one of the things that makes us so special is I'll probably cry a lot through this interview. I feel very passionately about a lot of this. We get these kids that are like 18 to 22. A lot of people don't take those kids very seriously. And they will tell you everything about how it felt for them on the first day of camp and what would have made it better for them. They are the ones prancing around with like 3 sets of headphones on them, looking for those kids that are overwhelmed. They're the ones like, it's amazing. Like, and it's because they identify with it and they got through it, right? Like somebody took care of them, or in the worst of circumstances, they kind of powered through it on their own and then figured it out. But we have a community that is so focused on like feedback and listening very carefully to what people are telling us about what they need. And it just has this incredible effect of our young people helping us update ourselves and making sure that we are on top of what kids right now need to feel safe and to feel embraced.
Well, that's like one of the hallmarks of secular humanism, isn't it? Yeah. To constantly revise, to not be afraid to ask yourself the hard questions of, am I doing this as well as it can be done? Right. Am I doing service to my community in a maximal way? And that's, I want to go. I want to go back in time, and then I want to go.
Amazing.
You can be a counselor.
We can talk soon about what it means to be a parent to go to Camp Quest, because
I already am a counselor. I have two campers. That's enough campers for me.
It's a very different experience to have other people's kids.
Yeah. Oh, for sure. I mean, I taught for probably 15 years, and this was mostly before I had children, and so a lot of that time was, of course, spent very, in a sense, vicarious, because the kids would go home after class, you know, and so I got them for a very focused time. And so often I would get them when they're at their best, because they respected me and they wanted to perform well. But at the same time, I was always asking myself, what can I learn from this interaction with the kid, from the interaction with their parent, from seeing them with their parent, or seeing them interact with their peers, both in front of and away from their parents. Like, how much data can I draw from this so that when I'm a parent, I can bring it to bear? And I love that the counselors it isn't even that they're encouraged to do it. It seems like they just do it organically because of the culture of the camp. Like, they're encouraged to pay attention to each other. Right. They're encouraged to pay attention to the camp structure. And then they feel like they have to pay it back or pay it forward, as it were. And what rate do you see campers as they sort of age out return to be counselors? Like, what percentage would you say?
So I would say since COVID, our data tracking has not been great. So it's hard for me to give that like exact number, but that's one of the things we're working on getting back to, because we used to be great at it. But it's very high. I will say that as kids get older, the number of them that are able to attend camp because of summer obligations, like band, sports, things like that, we do see a dropping off. However, it is the strongest parts of our program. This year, our camper population was so heavily skewed to 13 and above.
Amazing.
It's very interesting. Like, post-COVID,
oh my gosh,
people have become more hesitant about sending their young kids to camp, but older kids who find camp are like, oh, like, I'm just like, they won't give it up, right? Like, they find this space that feels so good given the experiences they've had in our recent history.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I would say that like most of our LT programs are graduating, and the majority of those kids go on to become counselors.
That's that first wild. Year. Especially, like you just said, especially considering how much potential social stunting there was during COVID because of kids having lack of access to each other in person. That to see them just sort of like collectively feel like, this is something that I was missing. I need to get back into this. Oh my gosh, this is the best thing ever. Mom, why haven't you told me about this before? That's pretty cool.
Right. And I just think that the feeling that they had about what they were missing was so much. They were able to like recognize so much more deeply. That's what was missing. And then when they came to camp, they were like, this is what fixes it.
Yeah.
The other thing that's been really interesting is watching young people reach out to us, some of the older generations of leaders, And we've been, actively asking them, like, what do you need from us? And one of the things they told us was we need to figure out how to get rid of our phones. We are so stressed about the impact that this has had on us. Like, these are young 20-something adults asking us to help support them in figuring out how to manage the negative impact that electronics have had on their life. And that's another wonderful thing about camp is a week away from any screen. That is a great reset for kids. They really need it. And it's part of how they discover themselves because the engagement with screens constantly, right, for many things that are important, like school, also has like a dampening impact on their ability, I think, to really figure out what's going on inside of them.
And kids have such rich emotional lives that a lot of parents, unfortunately, don't recognize it or accept that it's a possibility even. And, oh man, yeah, I want to go to Camp Quest.
Yeah. One thing you said also reminded me of something I think is really important. You were saying how when you were a teacher, right, you got to see the kids in this particular context and then they went home and you could see all the fullness of their lives. And we don't get that, right? But what we do get is the fullness of what it feels like for them to have that experience away from home, right? We're not shielded from, the fact that they just wet the bed or something very vulnerable happened to them. And now they have to share that with another person that is, and like the test that a kid has of looking to an adult and needing them to respond in the right way. And us, I think most of the time, almost always responding in the way or figuring it out, right? And if we don't respond in the right way at first, we're going to apologize to that kid and we're going to get it right. And so we get that that vulnerability of accessing these moments that most of the time only parents have, giving the child their medication, whatever those things are. And I think that's really, really powerful for kids to have another adult or a group of adults step in and provide for them in a comprehensive way that they've only ever really experienced much of the time with their parents.
So this is now leading me in like a really interesting direction thought-wise. Given how nurturing and accepting Camp Quest is, and what you just said about the child being away from their family culture and being forced to respond or adapt or be open, perhaps. I would imagine that parents who send their kids to Camp Quest, knowing what Camp Quest is, already are themselves probably more inclined to do that in some capacity, at least at home. But like, how would you characterize the sort of like the camper demographic when it comes to a potential for kids to not have that at home and then to have that at Camp Quest? Does that ever happen? Or is the demo pool for the potential campers already so liberal and humanist that you never see that disconnect between what they would experience at home and what they experience at camp?
Yeah. I think I would say that the majority of time there's a disconnect, even if the values are the same, the style and technique that is used, right, is going to be different, even just like the language that a child is responded to with. Like, I think most of the time we are grounding these kids in something that is fundamentally different because all people are different. But yes, we absolutely have people who are just not coming from a background where that's happening. Like, you'd be surprised.
I am surprised.
A lot of people, it's really hard to be a parent. You're not surprised by that. And I think that it is really difficult for some people to see past whatever it is that those blinders are, like well-intentioned, good, progressive people. We all have blind spots. Even those of us like myself who have like literally dedicated my adult life to youth development. I'm a foster parent. I've done all of this work. And I know that when I send my kids to camp, there are adults there who explain what they need to them better or respond to them better or embrace them better than I can, because I can't be everything they possibly need. And people are attuned to different things, right? Like, that's the wonder of knowing that there might be 5 or 6 adults who very, very strongly and meaningfully interact with your child, which means that all those people will probably notice something different about what they might be doing in that moment. They might see something about themselves. So I think that no matter what, your kids are going to get something that they're not getting from you, because there's this whole fleet of people who care deeply about it and are trained to deal with it. And they're going to do that from their own lens. But I also think it's surprising to see how many kids really come forward saying, wow, like I was not getting this at home in the way that I needed. It definitely does happen.
And I want to go back to that training because Pops, you said like it just sort of comes from the culture. But I think I actually have my doubts about that. So I'm wondering if there is specific things that you do to make sure that new people coming in as counselors and support staff are doing all of those things that are the ethos of the camp.
Right. Yes. So I think it is both, right? It came out of our culture and then we wrote it down and we started teaching it. And we realized really early on in our history that so many things that you would assume would be the case, like even just that the kids are going to come from a certain background and have a certain set of expectations and values, were very often not the case. And that we had to let go of all of these beliefs we had about ourselves, about other people, about how people presented. Like you could have someone come into camp and they would really read as super confident. And then you'd find out 3 years later that, man, they had the hardest time integrating into camp. And we all read that completely wrong. And so we started learning to document those things. We share across our camps. One of our greatest strengths is that we have so many talented people who deeply care about like creating documentation. And then we share those things with one another. And we're always exchanging best practices and working together as a network to figure out, you know, who has the better way to say that or exactly the right way to break down that problem so that people, when we train them, understand how to approach it. And that is a constantly evolving project. So we have camp manuals, we have national training that is given on safety and reporting, mandatory reporting, all those kinds of things, right? Like the sort of basics you would expect from any youth development professional. And then on top of that, we have a tremendous amount of cultural training and efforts to train as we go. So we do a whole day prior to campers arriving is just staff working on things together, talking through scenarios, sharing their experiences from past years, doing icebreakers, making sure that everybody knows like all the safety protocols and what happens if there's a fire and that kind of thing. And then there's just a lot of like sharing and friendship that are the foundations of those things as well. But we are very much dedicated to managing our responsibility to children. And that requires that we write lots of things down and do good training. The vast majority of our camps are also ACA accredited, which is quite a feat. ACA requires an enormous amount of documentation and process and policy in order to meet that standard.
And can you say what ACA is?
The American Camp Association.
Oh, okay.
That's
So they have a
what I was going to
standardized
say.
process for basically approving that you run a safe camp where you've thought through all the contingencies. So I would say all of our camps meet that standard, and most of our camps have documented that they meet that standard by going through the process. Because we are all volunteer as camps, it is such a huge lift to get that. So our camps have invested in that. All of our camps intend to get to that point. But we're really all like on a foundation of very similar materials, if that makes sense.
Oh, totally. And then when it comes to like the goofiness and the culture, how much of that is your team sort of crafting it through the activities?
Yeah.
And how much are the campers sort of bringing their own ideas to the table?
I would say that it is largely incredibly intentional. So what we have found is if we aren't intentional and you leave kids to kind of find the path to goofiness themselves, sometimes they don't have great boundaries around how the goofiness emerges, right? So kids love to do pranks. If you don't set good boundaries around what a positive pranking culture will be, they will go off into left field and make someone cry, right? And so we've like, if we sense that a group of kids is wanting to do pranking, like we are going to go in there and make sure that we've got consent for pranks. We understand that a prank is something that builds people up and is funny. So one of the pranks that people do at camp sometimes is go into someone's space with permission and put up a bunch of Post-its about wonderful things about the people in that cabin. Right? It's surprising, it's silly, and it accomplishes what kids want there. And then I think a lot of the culture of goofiness has to be modeled because kids, especially now, are very guarded. They're very afraid to put down what they feel is like that cool veneer or whatever it is that they're trying to express about themselves to the world, especially as they get older. And so it really is important for them to see adults doing that. And so one of the things that we emphasize to our adults is like, you've got to go all in, right? If we're singing a song, you're going to sing that song all in as well, right? If we're not going to do the like goofy dance, how can we expect that our teenager is going to do that as well? So there is an intentionality there for sure. But once you get it going, then it takes on a life of its own. Like I have been to multiple camp quests where there has been a revolution or a union formed by the children. And that is like the most beautiful thing to watch.
Revolution.
Yes. And the revolution was intentional in that we thought it was likely that the children by the end of this would form a revolution.
You foresaw a revolution?
We anticipated that one of the potential outcomes was revolution, yes. So it was actually a camp I went to this summer in Camp Quest Northwest. And they have like an incredibly creative camp team that almost does like a full-on LARPing situation every year for camp. So they will have a full storyline. And this idea was actually created by a former camper who became a counselor and then became program director. And she had been planning this idea for like 6 years to essentially make like a very silly, goofy dystopia for the kids. And at the beginning, they set some rules and the rules had to be goofy. So like one of the rules was you can't eat boiled carrots, right? And then we had like a character who we called the Arbiter come in and increasingly start to make modifications to the rules or do things like at one point banned tattoos. And so the idea here was just to see how the kids would respond to like their system that they had set up, right? They had set up the system of government and rules for themselves. And then somebody came in and tried to disrupt it. And what would they do? Well, what they did at the end was revolt and overturn the country and commission one of the invisible creatures of the camp to become, and then this all got organized to become like a revolutionary leader. And this all ended up being organized by like a group of 16 and 17-year-olds who are LTs who were allowed in to the staff planning on what the storyline was through the week. And then they became like the leaders of the kids. And it was like completely organic. We watched it happen. We guided it. At one point, they wanted to deface some of the signs that had the rules. And so we oversaw that so that the defacing of the signs was appropriate and funny and didn't rip them up or destroy anyone else's artwork, but instead was like additive and positive. So we're doing that, but we're not stopping them from doing what they want to do.
Wow.
Yeah.
I mean, that's amazing. That gives a little bit of the flavor that I've been seeing.
Yeah. It's a lot of effort. Like it is adults who are 100% all in. Like we are ears to the ground. We're like, hey, we just heard so-and-so talk about this, right? We overheard this group of teens and it seems like maybe they're going to go off the rails. So like, let's make sure we get them back on track so they can do what they want and have it be positive. So it's,
I mean, that's an amazing example. Is there any other like favorite thing that you've seen done at a camp that you'd want to talk about?
So one of my very favorite activities is something we call HONAB, House of Nails and Beautification. So this is an activity that started very early in our history. And all we did was set out makeup and face paint and nails. And then it got to tattoos and all sorts of other things. And now we have an official Camp Quest temporary tattoo as well. And we were basically like, kids, come decorate yourselves. And it is incredible to watch. We always have some adults, especially adult males, who come in there and immediately allow themselves to be adorned by the kids as however they want, and then confidently walk around with whatever a full face of like Tammy Faye Baker level makeup, or, you know, get their toes and fingernails painted 17 times through the week. Like these are real things that are happening. And it's great. It just creates this culture of expression and liberation. And it is so simple. It just requires us to like provide the kids with the goods and then they go from there. And every year it's an amazing thing to watch them dig into stuff, especially for boys, that is often restricted, and to just give them access. Campers with full sets of face tattoos. It's amazing.
I feel like this is a good time to ask because since it was founded in opposition to some of the things that the Boy Scouts were doing, is there anything you can talk about sort of specifically as far as it being a particularly safe space for queer kids?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So this is one of the things that we discovered pretty organically early in our history. So by the time I had joined, we were already, and I joined in 2000, 2, we were already very actively recognizing that we had lots of queer volunteers and queer campers, and we wanted to be able to serve them. And it was our natural inclination to be very open. But there was also a pretty good generational divide at the beginning. Like I said earlier, there was like an older generation of white male atheist activists who very much had their hearts in that place, but didn't actually know how to execute that work. Like, what would it look like to transform a camp to being really safe and queer affirming? And so that was the work of sort of the first generation of younger folks that came in that included myself. And yeah, I mean, it amounted to lots of things, right? Like we started changing the way that our forums asked questions, and we started changing the way we trained people to talk about families or to talk about people's interests, to be really open. We started offering like an opt-in sex education program at camp that many of our camps do very consistently year to year. And that is always very queer inclusive. And then over time, we started, as the more we broke down the role of sexuality and gender in the way that we ran camp and how we interacted with people, the more we started to realize, like, why are we also imposing this very traditional gender segregation on our campers and keeping them in boys' cabins and girls' cabins? And then, of course, we started to have kids that were coming that were identifying as non-binary and gender fluid or wanted to identify with a different gender. And sometimes that would even maybe change during the week. And so we started exploring what was felt, and I think sometimes still feels to people like a very radical idea of just not including gender as part of the factor in how we separated cabins. So we started separating them by age. Some camps will still offer, like, you can be in a single sex cabin if you'd like. And one thing that's been interesting to us is how few campers want that, and how often it's actually the campers that are trans that feel a little more strongly about being in those single gender cabins. And so, you know, like that has been a journey for us, but we are just incredibly flexible in general with all of these things. So if a camper's telling us that there's some need that we can meet for them in terms of their gender identity or their exploration of who they are, we're going to try to meet that camper where they're at and where they need us to be. When we first rolled this out, we've always done camp names, and you've always been welcome to change your name during camp or have a different name from what your parents signed you up with, if you like. And in the beginning, when we were offering this, we had some of our trans kids really test us, right? Like, how far will you go to support me? What if I change my name every day? Will you still call me the name I want to be called? And we were like, let's get out the dry erase marker, right? Like, we got it. We got dry erase markers. Just change it. Let us know what you need to be called. We'll make sure we look at your name tag. And so I think it's that like ethos of, we are going to listen to what our families are telling us. This is a constantly evolving project. And what we care about is that you feel empowered to explore, because that's what childhood is about. It is about being able to try different things on and see how they feel, and also to be able to ask the kinds of questions you want answers to, especially questions that maybe, even if you have a great relationship with your parents, you might still not feel like you can ask them that. So many of our camps will do like a confidential Ask Me Anything, where the older kids will get to submit questions to adults and ask questions about, you know, how, like questions about sexuality or, you know, experiences they had or concerns that they have. And we have always people at every camp session that have the kind of expertise that is necessary to be able to answer those questions in effective ways. And we have training that also lets our volunteers know that if you don't feel that you can effectively answer a question a camper has, here's what you do so you can find someone who can, because we will have someone on staff who can.
Wow. So I have a question from Go, because are you familiar with Corey Silverberg's books, Sex is a Funny Word?
I think I have heard of them, but I've definitely not read anything.
Okay. So they're kind of amazing. I'd really love to have them on the podcast at some point, but they talk about gender and everything in a very expansive way. And I don't know what it was in the section we were reading, but Go said something about, like, how would you keep these things separate? Maybe we're talking about restrooms. I don't know. But I was like, well, that's interesting, because I'm talking to somebody from this camp where the cabins they don't always, it's mixed gender cabins. And he was like, oh, that's really cool. how does that kind of work? So for a kid kind of wondering how that's going to go down, because campers do need to change and all those sorts of things, like how is that handled?
Yep. So all of our campgrounds, right, have private facilities for changing and bathing and things like that, right? So we wouldn't go to a campground that had that communally set up, right? And so, we just train the kids that like we maintain our privacy, right? We're not going to change our clothing in the cabin area. And we wouldn't do that even if our cabins were gender segregated, because that's not appropriate. It's important to have boundaries, and you never want to blur those boundaries with the kids or with the adults. And so, they go to the bathroom and do those things. And we also have great supervision. We supervise in the bathroom. So obviously you're in your private stall and you're doing your thing. But if a camper's taking a long time, you better believe I'm paying attention to that. And I'm like, hey, camper, you've been in the restroom for 30 minutes. Like, what's going on? Right? Like, we are keeping track of all of that stuff. We always know where all of our campers are. So it's a mixture of maintaining privacy and supervising private settings to make sure they remain private, and also just constant supervision of the campers. Like, we are in the rooms with the campers, and there's, at least 2 counselors in that cabin with them supervising. And we also have a rule of 3. So if you are outside of a private space, so outside of like a restroom stall, you always have to be with at least 2 other people. And typically speaking, we would, maybe send like 2 campers with a counselor. But in most cases, especially if you're going pretty far, we're going to try to make sure there's at least 2 adults with 1 camper at any time going anywhere substantial, right? More than a few hundred feet away.
Okay. So that kind of leads into my other question. So it's so funny because when we were writing back and forth, I told you that I thought Go was like way too much of a homebody to want to do a sleepaway camp. And then when we started having that discussion, he started asking more questions, and I was kind of trying to answer them. And I asked him if he'd ever want to go to a camp like that. And he was like, can my brother go? Is my brother going to be there too? And I said, well, yeah, but he'll probably be in a different cabin.
Yes,
and he was like, sure. Oh, then definitely. He's like, if I'm only with kids my age, I think I'd want to do that. So I know you mentioned the kind of post-COVID, less parents have felt comfortable sending younger kids to camp. And I'm kind of wondering, I have such mixed feelings about sleepaway camp because as a young person before being a teenager, my one experience of sleepaway camp was the religious camp that gave me a crisis that like defined the next 10 years of my life and sort of my identity. Right.
Right.
And that wasn't, in general, it was a pretty good camp. They were just religious and not thoughtful about ways that might impact non-religious kids there. But also, when I freaked out and wanted to leave, they weren't terrible, but they did some things that I think are sort of inappropriate. So, but then I had amazing experiences with sleepaway camps as a teenager, but I think I still have some of those emotions about sleepaway camp for kids. So I don't know. It's like the first year I've even thought about it for Reader and Go. And I'm just sort of wondering, what do you think parents should be thinking about when making this decision, and if their kids are ready, and how do we decide this?
Yes. So I think the first thing we have to think about is our own anxieties, right? I am a parent too, and I know I am bringing that, even though I know I shouldn't, I am bringing that to the table for my kids all the time, right? I have my own experiences, my own fears about things that could happen. And so I think it's important, because it is easy for us to project that onto our kids, or to think that we know them in totality, right? It's really incredible for me sometimes as a parent watching my kids be campers at camp that I'm like, I'm not even sure I know who that kid is. That the personality change that can happen when they're in a different environment and they're away is really interesting. So I think it's important to always recognize those things. And then I think that I would challenge a lot of parents to think about what would be the reasons that a kid wouldn't be ready, right? As opposed, I think people assume that they're not ready until there's signs that they are ready. And I tend to think that most kids are ready unless there's some pretty significant factors that would make them not ready. So things like having a fairly substantial developmental delay, or maybe certain kinds of things that might warrant an IEP at school might be things that would give me pause to say, is my child going to be ready in terms of behavior management or other things like that? But I think typically, even if a kid maybe wouldn't on their own express that they would feel comfortable and ready, most of the time kids are able to do it really, really well and surprise themselves. And that experience is incredibly powerful for kids. So we rarely send kids home for homesickness. It is often a problem on the first day, and we are expertly trained to deal with it. This is one of the things that we train the heaviest on. And another thing we train and are trying to ramp up our activities around are actually training parents for homesickness, to not set your child up, to make them experience camp in a way that gives them anxiety, because we can just like we don't realize it, but our own fears about sending our children and letting them go, which I think have been deeply raised by COVID and by the very important and necessary cultural awareness around the potential for victimization, right?
Yeah.
The potential for your child to end up in a situation in which they feel very unsafe and they don't have a good outlet for what to do. So our job as camp staff is, of course, to help our parents understand that we are being incredibly attentive to that and build that trust so that they know that we are looking for those things, that our supervision policies are, strong and enforced. And I feel very good about the way that we do those things at Camp Quests. And so it's just, I think, a balance. And I would say in general, nearly all of the time, the parents who are the most anxious to send their kids are the ones who at the end are like, I can't even believe this. I cannot believe that my child is telling me that they don't want to leave. They're refusing to get in the car. They're telling me to go away from them. And then the next year, they are like, please, don't talk to me. I'm embarrassed that you're even here dropping me off because my friends are here and I'm doing my thing. And that transformation is typically the way it works. There's always going to be exceptions, right? And of course, we also do know our kids, right? We might not understand every part of them, but I think it's just a hard balancing act. And the thing that I think sets your kid up for success the most is good communication. So sometimes parents have a tendency to think like, one, should I take my kid off their ADHD medicine before I send them to camp? No. Should I maybe not try to tell anybody about this problem that they're currently having in their life because I'm hoping that they'll just go to camp and it'll be reset and everything will be fine? No. These are not the right instincts, because there's a fear, I think, sometimes that people will be prejudiced against your child if you tell them the things they're struggling about. But it's incredibly important to be honest with camp staff about what your child is struggling with so that we can be ready. The sooner we know that we might have an issue with bedwetting or an issue with a recent transition or divorce, that we know the kinds of things to look for, the more that we can be attentive to that and train their cabin staff to look for it and to know what to do. So I think all of those pieces are what's most important for knowing that your kid is ready, is do you feel equipped to give the right information to people? Do you feel invested yourself in making sure that you are thinking about your own behaviors and anxieties so that you set them up for success? And do you feel confident that you've done the work you need to trust that staff, right? To ask the questions you have. Parents should be doing that. You should, whether it's Camp Quest or any other camp, know for sure that the things you care about and matter to you are going to happen at that camp for your child in the way that you think they need, in a broad stroke, right? So maybe not necessarily dictating every moment of how their daily ritual will go, because that might not happen, but letting us know that they have a lot of trouble being able to take a shower independently. So maybe someone needs to be there to support that from outside of the shower or something like that. Those things can be done.
Amazing. And now I just saw recently that registration was open for at least one of the camps.
Yes.
So in general, how soon do parents have to sign up their kids to think about getting a slot?
Yes. So for the vast majority of our camps, you're going to be able to still get a slot for the next few months.
Okay.
Some of our camps will sell out. We have some smaller camps and they will sell out sometimes in a day or two. And I would say that our registrations are starting to ramp up again and be pretty tight, right? We're starting to fill up sooner than our last deadline for signups. However, we are engaged in a constant process of bringing on volunteers to accommodate that. So our camps that have more capacity at their host camp, they might have a certain registration limit that is based on the number of volunteers they feel confident they can get. And then they may go out and recruit beyond that. So it does make sense if you find that a registration is already closed for a Camp Quest to contact that team, because they will have wait lists and they will also be able to give you a general sense of, do they feel like it's possible that your camper might be able to get in? Because sometimes those things are also based in, we have room in these particular cabins, but it's really room only for a camper with a certain, a camper that would be under 12, for example.
Mm-hmm.
So, I think people have time. We don't have camps, in every single place in the country, but I do think it's worth the drive, right? If you live within a reasonable driving distance of a Camp Quest, I think it's certainly worth considering.
Amazing. Is there anything else that we should have asked about that we didn't?
Let me think.
What's the food like?
Varied. I would not go for the food. I will say that this is actually one of the really interesting things about our community, and maybe even something that's a great thing to add here. So we are all reliant on host camps, right? So 4-H camps, sometimes YMCA camps, or other kinds of private campgrounds.
Got it.
The space. So in a lot of ways, we're reliant on whatever their food service is. Most of our camps, nearly all of our camps are not running food service ourselves. However, we very, very quickly let them know our population is full of like specific health needs and vegans and vegetarians. And so we're going to need a menu that's really customized to our population. And we have developed a reputation amongst host camps that we are just such a great group to work with. We have a lot of history of actually stealing camp staff from our host camps, joining our organization.
What?
2 people on our national board right now were staff at a host campground, joined our organization, and are now leaders, like national leaders of our organization, because their experience with us was so powerful. And the feedback that we get is, you all care more about the kids than any of the other groups that are in here. You are so kid-centered. You are so focused on kindness as a culture. And then we treat our host staff like that as well, right? We will invite them to our activities. We are going to be giving them so much thanks and kudos and support. And so like our camp in Ohio, one of the campgrounds we used for years and years, we just had a wonderful team. They actually wrote a grant to get a salad bar for our camp because our kids were the only ones who would eat vegetables. And they wanted to be able to accommodate our vegans, vegetarians more. And so I think that kind of feedback from other camp professionals is like very reassuring as well. And that is, I would say, like a pretty universal experience across our network, that our host camps just think we're great, love to work with us.
That is so cool.
Mm-hmm. And it really is just so fun. Like I think I tend to be kind of like a little bit uptight. I have a hard time letting go. And it's so nice to go to camp and be able to just be, silly, do the thing that everyone else is doing, wear glitter and let kids dictate how my day goes.
All right. That was so awesome. And on the next episode, we're going to talk with Katie just a tiny bit about the experience she has had fostering, which hopefully is going to tee up a larger conversation about secular fostering for us this year. So keep an eye out for that on the next one. And I think that's it. As always, we need to thank Jonathan Zalbin and First Frame Music for the music for this podcast.
And that wraps up this episode of The Family Skeptical, where nothing is sacred except for our kids. Yay.
All right. Who knows how that's all going to turn out, but we did it.
Yay.